Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Books to Last podcast. This week we're joined by Bianca from Your Words My Ink, and we talk fantasy, our shared hatred of sand, representation, and everything in between. I really hope you enjoy. Hello Bianca, thank you so much for joining us on the Books to Last podcast. How are you feeling today?
I am feeling good, a little bit hot. It is actually still summer here, so
Oh wow, that's lucky. It's so cold here at the moment.
no, it's very hot here. I've turned the aircon off because I don't want it to interfere. But yeah, it's warm.
We really appreciate your sacrifices.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's still quite cold here. Spring hasn't quite sprung for us, so I'm hoping that the weather will start perking up a little bit here soon. So, are you reading anything at the moment? What are you thinking of it?
I am actually reading Rule of Wolves, the new Leigh Bardugo book. It's going slow. I have had to increase the text size a considerable amount because I had eye surgery a week ago. So now the book is 900 pages long and I'm just struggling through it.
Oh, I'm the opposite. I tend to decrease the text size to the smallest one. But I always get really disheartened when I'm in a book, especially and it gives you the predicted amount of time until the end of the chapter, and I think it's till the end of the book, and then I realize it's not.
Yeah, so it's taking me a while. I am enjoying it, but I'm not that far into it yet. So yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm a big Leigh Bardugo fan, but I get tired of books really quickly, especially if the series drags on. So with the Grishaverse, I'm hoping this is the last one.
Yeah, I have that problem with with series. I have kind of got myself into trouble with starting series when they're not all out, because if I have to wait a year for the next installment, my head's so far out of that world that even though I really enjoy the series, I don't want to know what happened as much as I did when I finished the last book. I think the only series I've been able to read as it gets released is Rick Riordan's books, because he would without fail, it used to be I think it's changed now because he does more, but I think the 7th of November without fail you were going to get a new book. Yeah. But yeah, I've just had my first experience with Leigh Bardugo. I just finished The Six of Crows, which I've never read anything by her before.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, it was recommended actually by the last guest on this podcast, because and I was struggling to think of what to read, and she sort of sold me on it so well, and it sounded a lot like another book which was a favorite of mine, and I was like, oh, I'll give it a try, and then I think I read it in a day. I started it on my Kindle, and then I stayed up until 1 o'clock in the morning to finish it.
It is a good book. It's very hyped at the moment, but I think it deserves the hype because it is a good book.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorites.
I've heard so much sort of hype around it on social media, and I think that's probably why I hadn't. Also, I knew it was part of the Grishaverse, and I haven't read the main Grisha trilogy, and I was a bit oh, don't know if I want to commit to another trilogy at the moment. So I thought that I'd have to read it before, but yeah. Okay, so Rule of Wolves, feeling slow at the moment, but it might pick up.
It might pick up. I'm excited for it, but we'll see where it goes.
For anybody who's listened to the podcast who maybe hasn't heard it before, how we do it on the Books to Last podcast is we challenge someone who loves books and has read far and wide, and we get them to pick the only 5 books they can take with them when they're cast away to a isolated remote location. The only 5 books they can take with them, and they have to read forever. As part of this, our guest gets to pick the isolated location they get to go to, because we aren't limiting ourselves to just desert islands, unless our guest wants to go to one. So with that in mind, Bianca, where would you like to be cast away to?
Okay, so I thought about it and I absolutely hate sand. So
Same. Sorry, that's why I don't do the desert island. I hate it
yeah,
so much.
I'm not a fan of sand or the heat or anything like that. So I would really like to go to someplace cold, ideally maybe Scotland or the UK or somewhere over there. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of sand and being warm and those types of things. So I want to isolate, if you could call it that, in Scotland.
Well, Scotland would be an excellent place to do it, and it's quite a popular choice as well. I've visited Scotland briefly, and yeah, in the hills and the wilds and all that sort of stuff, excellent places to go to. You could be in a cabin or some other remote
Castle
place.
type.
A castle. Oh, to be fair, they do have really excellent
Yeah.
castles, very good castles. Okay, so we're going to a castle in Scotland, which is an excellent place to read, I would think. So, what is the first book you will be taking with you to your remote castle?
Okay, so I just want to say that this was impossible. I don't like rereading books. So I had to give some serious thought into books that I would like to reread. And I got 7, but obviously 2 of them are honorable mentions. So the first one on my list is Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. Apologies for pronunciations. English is not my first language. But yeah, that's my first book, Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir.
That is one I've heard of, but not one I've read. Would you mind giving us a bit of information about what it's about?
Yeah, so it's the second book in a series, the first book being Gideon the Ninth. And I really enjoyed Gideon, but Harrow just stood out for me like it was the best. The short description is that it's necromancers in space.
Sold.
So, yeah, brief description, but it's such a big story and so complicated, and the lore is so fascinating and amazing. So basically what happens in Gideon the Ninth is Gideon is sort of a slave to one of the worlds in this space setting. We don't know much about the setting, but she has to follow her sort of master, sort of like that, Harrow, to go and compete in these trials to become a lictor. So a lictor is essentially an immortal necromancer who's very powerful and kind of like serves their god. So in the first book, they go and they face these trials, and I don't want to give too much away what happens in the end, but it was quite shocking. And then Harrow the Ninth follows Harrow, as she is now a lictor and she has to fight alongside their god to protect their solar system, I guess you could call it. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of descriptions on how the necromancy works and everything, but it'll just blow your mind away.
It sounds really, really epic, and it is a book that I've heard a lot of praise about. And it's interesting when it's the second one in the series as opposed to the first, because the first is usually a favorite. What is it about, I suppose, Harrow as a character in particular that maybe makes her stand out a little bit more than Gideon?
I love Gideon. She is a badass all around. But Harrow is the necromancer and she is just equally as badass. She's supposed to be like the best one of her generation. So she does a lot of awesome stuff. I listen to the audiobooks actually, because getting books in South Africa is a challenge. But the audiobook narrator just delivers her lines with this, it's like a punch to your gut. And it's just amazing. Like, I cannot stop recommending this book. And if I think about the ending of Harrow the Ninth in particular, I want to cry because the next book's not coming out for another year. So that's disappointing.
Yeah, it's it's amazing the difference a good audiobook narrator can make, really. I recently listened to, I think, the second book in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it's narrated by Martin Freeman, which is just amazing anyway. But he did a really, really good job with the narration there. 2 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Someone is cutting hedges outside my window, which they weren't doing when we started. Okay, so Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn. Necromancers in Space really sounds really, really cool. Would you say it's more of a sort of like a dark magic book or a sci-fi book, or is it quite an even blend of the two? Because those aren't two things that I would have put together.
It's definitely sci-fi in the sense that Harrow the Ninth takes place on a space station. So you definitely have some sci-fi elements, and there's planets and like planet-sized monsters and everything like that. But in a sense, it's also fantasy because necromancy it's magic, but the way that it's blended in together, this world just makes so much sense. And Harrow the Ninth is parts of it is written in second-person perspective, which
tricky.
It's tricky. It was really jarring when I started it because I was a little bit lost because how Gideon the Ninth ended. I didn't think we'd take this route, but at the end, she actually reveals why she wrote it in second person, and then your jaw just drops, and it's amazing. It makes so much sense, and I think it was used really well in this book. And I don't read a lot of books in the second person perspective. I don't think it's very common for books to be that way.
No, I think it's second person. I think it's actually, I think it's quite difficult to do very well. So I think it tends to be avoided. And I cannot think of a single book I've read in the second person. So that's really, really interesting.
It's not the entire book. There is different scenes that's written from third person perspective. And I was confused until about halfway through, and then things start making sense and you start to realize, okay, but this is what happened in Gideon the Ninth. So this must be what's happening in Harrow. So yeah, I don't want to give too much away, but it is just a spectacular book. Like, this woman is a genius. I don't know how she did it, but she is a genius.
Yeah, she sounds it. I suppose the reason why I asked about the sort of the magic and sci-fi elements being mixed was I read the first book in the Beautiful Creatures series, which it's not quite as drastic a difference. It's very sort of it's like Southern America, that kind of atmosphere with like a very dark occult kind of witch atmosphere. And the thing is, those two things do sound like they should mix really, really well. But the way the book is written, I think maybe because it's got two authors and I think they alternate chapters. But when I was reading it, I just remember the two vibes of the two chapters. They felt like two completely different books, and it really sort of took me out of it. So it's really good to hear that it's like done really well in this one. Really, really bold start to the list. What is the second book that will be joining Harrow the Ninth?
Okay, so the second book is kind of similar in a way that it blends science fiction and fantasy really well. And that is The Spark of White Fire by Sangu Mandanna. Again, sorry for pronunciation.
Don't worry, I'm terrible with pronouncing other people authors' names.
So, A Spark of White Fire, it's so good. These books are so good. It is a retelling of the Mahabharata. It's an Indian sort of like, I don't think it's a religion or stuff like that, but it's ancient Indian stories.
Oh, so like ancient Indian folklore and mythology and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I read it first. I was on a blog tour for the second book, but I hadn't read the first one yet, which happens quite often.
Yeah, that's the way of book bloggers. I know that.
And I read this book in one sitting. It was that good. It is set in space, but it has magic. It has gods. The gods interfere in human lives and everything like that. So it is just so good. I'm not very good at giving descriptions of books, aside from just saying how good they are. But yeah, I have Goodreads open, so I'm going to kind of like read it, but
Yeah.
I'll give some cliff notes. So the Goodreads description is basically raised alone and far away from her home, Ismay longs to return to her family. When the king of Witchtar offers the gift the unbeatable sentient warship to a warrior who can win his competition, she sees her way home. She'll enter the competition, reveal her true identity to the world, and help her brother win back the crown. So it's kind of like a royalty mixed with, warships and space travel and gods. And it's just, you think that these kinds of fantasy blends with science fiction wouldn't work well. Because when you think science fiction, you think, okay, science.
Aliens.
But, yeah, aliens. And then you have all these gods who can do magic and play tricks on people. And it works really well. So this is just a really amazing book.
It sounds it. And I mean, for it to be a sort of you not having read the first one and then reading the second one, and it to sort of pull you into the world really well. I mean, so that sounds really great. I remember when I used to have my book blog, I requested the second and third books in series so many times because they're not well advertised as sequels. But it is always really interesting when you don't go into it and you don't feel, I suppose, completely lost.
The first book, the Spark of White Fire is the first book, but even going into the second book, the world building, it just keeps on, it keeps on building up, and you start to realize how interconnected things are. And it's just amazing when authors can set up a really good first book and then everything pays off in the second book. But the second book should also be setting up for the third. So it's a really good blend. And this is just a really good space opera, if you could call it that, with magic involved.
Space opera is a good word. To be fair, I've really enjoyed some space operas recently, not so much in the royal fantasy sort of subgenre of sci-fi, if you could call it that. It tends to be, I recently read, it was a translated novel called, what's the first one called? I can tell you the sequels. I think it's called Ascension. And it's like a dating TV show, but in space. Yeah. And I remember reading it didn't seem like something I was gonna really enjoy, but it was really good. But yeah, space opera is a really great genre. And A Spark of White Fire, I mean, drawing in mythology and gods and space royalty is always really fun as well. I just read a book that had a lot of, well, it was more space politics than space royalty, but it is interesting because they can kind of completely make it up, but also harken back to like themes that we already have in sort of real life, quote unquote.
Yeah. And politics in this book is amazing as well, because Carly's brother is the heir to the throne, but he's been usurped. So currently her uncle is on the throne. So she wants to essentially infiltrate her uncle's court to help her brother get back on the throne. But when she gets there, she realizes they're not bad people, they're not bad rulers. So the family dynamics is amazing, and it's such a gray space to work in because her brother isn't completely right and her uncle isn't completely right. So you actually don't know which side she's going to choose. And I like that.
Yeah, we like a morally gray area. I always it's one of the difficulties I kind of had with, I suppose, I mean, Game of Thrones, because like when you've got people that you like on all sides, there's no ending that's going to completely satisfy everything you want to come out of it. But it's just really interesting to see where the cards fall. So more sci-fi excellence on the list with A Spark of White Fire. what is the third book that will be joining your sci-fi extravaganza for so far?
Okay, so the third book isn't a sci-fi book, and it's not a fantasy book either. It's Small Spaces by Sarah Epstein. It's a thriller. I think, yeah, contemporary psychological thriller. And I don't read a lot of thrillers because they don't usually like thrill me. So I'm not usually very invested in the plot. But this book had me entirely invested. It's YA as well. So the characters are a bit younger. And it follows the story of this girl who she saw one of her friends get kidnapped. And she thought a monster kidnapped her friend. It looked like a monster. And nobody actually believes her because she's a child and monsters aren't real, so no one believes her. And then I think it was like a few months later, her kidnapped friend is found. And the kidnapped friend just doesn't say a word. She doesn't speak at all anymore. So no one really knows what happens to these two. And then the book starts off with this main character kind of seeing the monster again. And you don't know what's real. You don't know if the monster is actually a person. And she has these sort of blackouts that happen where she thinks she's done something or she thinks she saw the monster, but it didn't actually really happen. So there's a very fine line between reality and fiction. But it was an amazing book. It had me up like the whole night reading, and then I couldn't sleep because I was scared.
I see. That's the reason why I don't tend to read thrillers myself either, because I read when I sort of, even when they're really good ones, because I usually sort of connect to the imagery so much when I'm reading. They just give me nightmares. And I mean, I have that issue with fantasy books as well, because some of them can get real dark. But it just seems like playing with fire with the with thriller ones. It just feels worse. More people get kidnapped and killed and bad things and all that sort of stuff. But that sounds really, really interesting. Does it end on a cliffhanger? Do you get a resolution at the end?
You get a resolution. It's a standalone, so there is a resolution at the end that it is kind of like an episode of Criminal Minds, if I could call it that. And I was really blown away by it because it was a young adult book, and I didn't expect it to take such a deep look at your mental health and what happens when you go through like extensive trauma like this. So it was a really good book, and it ended really well. I mean, spoiler alert, but there's a happy ending. And yeah, I like it when these kind of characters sort of overcome their trauma and they deal with their trauma and they don't just shove it to the side. So it is a really good book.
That sounds really good. And I think a good deep dive into sort of mental health, especially in the YA genre, is definitely a good thing. I know I suppose that's one thing that fantasy books don't always, like a lot of the YA fantasy books that I've read. I should probably disclaimer, I've not read all of them. But the fantasy YA books that I've read, a lot of the main characters go through like huge amounts of trauma, but because it's not identified as trauma and they don't always necessarily, I don't know, have the fallout that they would maybe if that was more of a theme. Sometimes they kind of just skip over all of it and go on and they save the world anyway, and it's not really addressed. One of the it's good when it is addressed as like something that needs to be fixed, because it's a good really sort of authentic feeling character arc and development. So that's really, really good, and quite a change of pace for the list. So we have got sort of our different takes on sci-fi and a very, very thrilling thriller, which is technically what you want. What is the fourth book that will be joining on your list?
Okay, so I'm taking a left turn again because I thought the list should be, diverse in terms of genre, because you get tired of reading one genre over and over again. So the fourth book on my list is Get a Life, Chloe Brown, a romance book by Talia Hibbert. We read it for our book club, I think in February, yeah. And I don't normally read romance, but I loved this book. So basically, Chloe Brown is chronically ill, so she can't do much. And she decides that she, wants to start living her life again despite this illness. So she makes a list of kind of like a bucket list, but not a bucket list because she's not going to die. So she makes this list to help her get a life. And then she meets her, I don't think he's her landlord, he's like the maintenance guy in her building. And she gets him to help her with her list. And then obviously romance ensues. But it was just such an amazing book that took such a real look at mental illness, or not mental illness, chronic illness, and how it affects your life and how it affects your mental well-being as well. And it just, the book had me feeling many things.
That's really nice. I didn't actually, so I've seen Get a Life, Chloe Brown come up on my social media feeds quite a lot, but I didn't actually know what it was about, and I didn't know that it had sort of chronic illness representation, which is really, I know, something that isn't very well represented in literature at the moment. So that's really, really great. And it's doesn't the author have a few sort of sequels or books in the same sort of area? So that's really, really good. Yeah, romance never used to be one that I used to read when I first sort of got into reading when I was a teenager. I was very much like, no, I don't read romance. I don't read that. I like fantasy and people being in sword fights and that sort of thing. I am not interested in romance. And then I think when Dimple met Rishi was the thing that kind of changed it, because that's like YA romance, and all of the books in that series I absolutely adore, and it kind of just sparked another genre that I read, because I tend to not stick to that many genres anymore. I'm not exclusively fantasy like I used to be, and I found myself seeking out romance a lot more last year because it's very fun and light-hearted, and that's really what 2020 needed. Yeah.
Good at the end. I also started reading a bit more romance last year because I was tired of fantasy and I just wanted something different. So I read a few romance books, and I've been meaning to read Get a Life, Chloe Brown. So we picked it for the book club, and I read the sequel, or not. It's not a direct sequel, they follow different characters. But there's 3 books, and each follows one of the Brown sisters. So Chloe is the oldest, and then Take a Hint, Danny Brown is the second one. I just finished it like a few days ago, and it was just so funny and so relatable and so sweet, and it just makes me wish my life was a romance novel.
Yeah, last year definitely just because everything was going on. I mean, in most of the books that I read, like especially sort of with fantasy, they're very high stakes and the world's basically ending. And then I guess part of that was like escapism, but when it kind of, and the world wasn't ending last year, but it felt like it sometimes. And I was a bit like, this isn't escapism anymore, this is just what my life feels like. So I wanted low stakes, light-hearted, mainly funny, and romance kind of delivered on all of those things, which was really, really fun. So I will have to add Get a Life, Chloe Brown to my reading list, because it sounds really, really, really fun, and I love a YA romance that spawns a series. I apologize if I pronounce it wrong. The Sandhya Menon books, When Dimple Met Rishi, and all of the ones afterwards are just so fun and lovely. And to be fair, I think There's Something About Sweetie is my absolute favorite of all of them, because it's just so nice. Makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside.
That's what you need in 2020 and in 2021. So
yeah, definitely. I've recently bought a few more romance but YA sort of books that I want to try out as well. So I'll add that one to the list for fun, light-hearted holiday reading. I find I always crave sort of romance and fluffy, nice, light-hearted books when I'm sort of on holiday, if that ever happens again. Um,
Yeah, same.
so yeah, really mixing it up. Are we going to be taking another wildly different turn for the fifth and final book of your
Yeah,
list?
we're going back to fantasy, but more traditional fantasy. And I think this is a really underrated fantasy book that more people should read. And that is The Queen of the Tearling by Erika Johansen. I read this book probably when I was not old enough to actually be reading it. But it is a very high fantasy book about this princess who she was sent away from home, and her uncle has been ruling since her mother died. And now that she's turned 18, she has to kind of go back to her kingdom and rule. But her kingdom is on the verge of a war with another kingdom, and her uncle has spent all their money, and it's just everything is in dire stakes here. Um, and the protagonist, Kelsey, I think that's how you pronounce her name. That's how I say it in my head. She is described as very plain, and she never has a love interest in the series. And that was kind of like one of the first fantasy books that I read without a romance subplot. And I absolutely adored it. And what makes this book really stand out is that it's kind of also sci-fi, because this fantasy kingdom that they live in, they used to live on Earth in our world. So in the future, Earth is dying and they need to escape. So they kind of like sail across a part of the ocean and disappear into this new world. And that premise is just, it's mind blowing. Like, it was such a good lore for this series. Like, they came from a normal, like we live today, and now they're in this world with magic. And the last book in the series kind of follows how they got to this new place, and it was just, yeah, it's a really good fantasy series.
It sounds really unique. I kind of like the lack of love interest through all of it, because I have to find when you've got sort of in the genre, when you've got female rulers, they immediately want to start marrying them off to people. And it tends to be like the entire, despite that they have other responsibilities to their kingdom, they're willing to sort of sacrifice everything for this one specific love interest. But the idea that she doesn't have any kind of gives me Queen Elizabeth I vibes, where she's like, no, I am married to my kingdom and I'm not interested in anybody else. Which is really, really cool. I always find it quite funny when they have kingdoms that have got failing finances, because when I was younger, I used to think that that was like so unrealistic. Like, why would any country ever get themselves into ridiculous amounts of debt? It just, I mean, you're a country, you're supposed to have money. And then I kind of grew up and realized the state of the finances of most of the countries in the world. And I was like, oh no, that's pretty spot on.
Yeah, it is spot on, especially in South Africa. We're basically broke. But yeah.
I to be honest, I kind of stopped keeping track of the UK areas, but our Chancellor of the Exchequer has been on a spending spree for the past 12 months, which was necessary. It was necessary, but I'm considering I'm the next generation that's I'm not necessarily looking forward to the fallout, but we'll see. But yeah, less serious topics. It sounds really, really like I've heard of Queen of the Tearling, but not very much. It's like a name that sounds familiar, but it's not something I've seen a lot of hype on social media, which immediately intrigues me because.
Yeah, I deserves a lot more hype. And the protagonist, she is described as very plain, and that's not something you usually see in a fantasy series. But she struggles with her, how she looks. And in the second book, she actually starts to use magic to change her appearance. And that was, for me, a really something that fantasy books never touch on, like she's the queen of this immense kingdom, but she's not beautiful or stunning in any way, and she is described as a little fat. And when she starts to change her appearance, the people around her start noticing, and they actually encourage her to just be who she wants to be, And if you want to be, healthier, it should be because you want to be it, and not because, someone else forces you. And the queen of the kingdom that they're at war at is described as this beautiful, sorceress, and she thinks she can't compete on that level. When actually all she needs to do is she needs to rule her kingdom. It has nothing to do with how she looks. So I really enjoyed that, as, being a little pudgier myself. It was really nice to see a protagonist who struggled with these things and who struggled with how she looks and how she wants the people to see her as. And in the end, she just, realized that it's not about how she looks, but what she can do for her kingdom, and she sacrifices a lot. So that was it hit home.
That's a really wonderful message, because I know what you mean. In fantasy books, they usually, if it's a female protagonist, they usually start the book with, oh, she the protagonist tends to think she looks very plain, and that's her opinion. But then eventually, as the book goes on, they find a way to completely erase that part of thing, and it's not addressed in a satisfying way. And more often than not, it becomes the sort of the Bella Swan trope of it. I'm sure she didn't invent it. But like she's so plain, but that one person sees her for who she is, the interesting person she is, and it's like really kind of it gets quite irritating over time, so especially when you've got when you have these really amazing, powerful, badass, intelligent heroines. It's almost like most authors don't know how to write a heroine like that who isn't stunningly beautiful. Like they can't just like, who isn't like,
it doesn't compute.
Yeah, I say stunningly beautiful doesn't fit the conventional definition of what like mainstream beauty, and it's just it does get kind of irritating. A lot of the time I find myself, when I'm reading fantasy series, is I actually pay very little attention to just, I suppose, unless it's particularly relevant, it's something that I tend to try and forget. Appearances of characters don't tend to thingy, but it's really wonderful that they sort of addressed that message, and that she was surrounded by people who didn't actively encourage her to use magic.
I just wanted her to be queen.
And it sounds like she does a really, really good job of that. And that sounds, sorry, I'm gonna have to read this book now, because I really
have to.
It just sounds like a very refreshing take on what is an element of fantasy that is very massively worked in and written at the moment.
And fantasy doesn't often include plus size characters or characters who are actually just normal looking. If I can describe it like that. But yeah, like most other popular fantasy series, I mean, you have these warriors who are queens, and they the fan art that you see of them, they're always thin, they're always pretty, and there's nothing wrong with being thin and beautiful.
A lot of the time they look exactly the same as well in the fan art, and it is a problem. I see a lot on social media of just like plus size representation in fantasy is not very good, and it's like they've got issues with like the new Grisha TV series, where they're essentially erasing that element of a character as well. And it's just a huge problem that isn't addressed very much, which people need to do better. And hopefully it seems like maybe we might be heading to a time when things are better, but everyone's got to keep pushing.
Yeah. So you definitely should read this book.
Excellent. So that's Queen of the Tearling, and it's part of a series. How many books are there in the series?
There's 3 books in the series, and a prequel just came out. I think the prequel is a standalone. I have an arc. I haven't read it yet because I'm behind. But it's a really good series, and I have some gripes with the ending, but nothing's perfect.
Yeah, I find that with trilogies a lot of the time. I mean, I suppose the ending is what it is. I mean, I know when Game of Thrones ended, a lot of fans weren't very happy with the way the story went, and I think a lot of people forget sometimes when they're really into a series that the creators of that fiction or world they don't owe you the ending you want. They owe you the ending that is supposed to come out of it, whether you agree with it or not. But trilogies, I often find it's like I either love the ending or I hate the ending. I remember when I finished the Divergent trilogy.
I was so mad.
I got to the end of that, and I remember I read those books in like 3 days straight. I basically sat in the same spot and I just read all three of them back to back. And I remember just finishing the last book and then quietly closing it and looking at it and then throwing it across the room.
Yeah, I don't even think I read the last few pages of the book. Like after the big thing happens, I kind of just close the book and I'm like, nope, sorry, not happening. Nope.
No, you 3 strikes, you're out. No, done.
Bye.
But I mean, it'll be good to okay. So I'm expecting an interesting ending to Queen of the Tearling trilogy. Well, that is your 5 books for the main list. Would you mind just recapping all 5 of them?
Yeah. Okay, so the first one was Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. Space opera, sci-fi, necromancers in space. Read it. The second one is A Spark of White Fire by Sangu Mandanna, based on Indian folklore. Also, please read it. The third one is Small Spaces by Sarah Epstein, so a YA thriller. The fourth one is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. A romance about a chronically ill character. Please read it. And the last one was Queen of the Tearling, a high fantasy book. Also, please read it.
And please read it. It feels like my motto. I constantly find myself.
Just read it, or just read it.
Read it. Okay, so those are the 5 books. You said, as you rightly say, it's an impossible choice. Not that I would know, because I've not had to make this choice of 5 books yet. So I can revel in that. But you mentioned you had a couple of honorable mentions. What were they? What nearly made the cut?
Okay, so what nearly made the cut was Sky Hunter by Marie Lu. It is a new release. I think it came out late last year. It is part of a duology, so I am finding myself leaning more towards duologies because trilogies take a long time and I'm not very good at finishing series. So 2 books kind of takes off the pressure. But Sky Hunter is basically about a woman. She cannot speak, and that is ideal in her job because this is a dystopian world and there's monsters outside that kind of, if you make a sound, they can find you. So she is a striker, part of a military force, and they fight these monsters. So she doesn't speak. It's not yet made clear if it's because of trauma or because, she was just born that way. But it is a really interesting thing because they use sign language in the book. So I really enjoyed it. It is set in like this dystopian San Francisco kind of place, where all the things that we have now is kind of like they see us as the ancient ones and we've destroyed our society, which is highly likely. And they now, attempt to live in the ruins of what we've left behind. So there's this federation that wants to take over the entire continent, and they are the last kind of like free city. So they're trying to fight off the Federation and all their monsters, and it's just great.
It sounds amazing. Mary Lou, I I've only ever read her Legend trilogy. It was one I read sort of when I was quite young, and I love that series so much. I've seen that she's read and she's written another book in that series. I don't know if
my TBR.
Yeah, it's not I don't know if it's come out yet. It's Rebel, and I think it's about Daniel's little brother, and I'm so excited. I need to read that one. But Mary Lou she definitely works really well in that dystopian world, doesn't she? And
yeah, she's one of my favorite authors.
I love the social commentary of the ancient ones destroying the world. Yeah. It feels like it's just about millennials and Gen Z complaining about how they've been at the moment. Yeah, very, very relatable. And a fairly recent release. So what was the second book that was on your honorable mentions?
Okay, so I didn't know if I was allowed to do this because it's a book I haven't read.
You are more than welcome to pick books that you haven't read.
Okay, great. It's The Martian by Andy Weir. I've seen the movie like a bajillion times because I love space. And I've been meaning to read the book, but I haven't gotten to it yet. But because I can watch the movie over and over, I'm guessing I would be able to read the book over and over. So yeah, The Martian, it follows a man called Mark Watney, and he's left on Mars all alone after they've had to evacuate, and his team thought he was dead, so they left him behind. And it's just how he survives on Mars. There's no monsters or horror elements aside from, actual space. But it is just, it's so good. And the movie is really good as well. So yeah, space is just one of my favorite things.
So The Martian was actually was a choice for one of our previous guests on the podcast for their list. And they really enjoyed it and hyped it up quite a bit. From what I understand, I haven't read The Martian or seen the film, but from what I understand the book is excellent, and the film is quite a good representation of it as well. So that would be a great honourable mention that you may try and smuggle into your castle in Scotland if I happen to not be looking. So, I mean, that's really, really excellent fun list. I was really looking forward to seeing what this would turn out, and I've, as expected, got many books to add to my shopping cart now. So yeah, if listeners wanted to maybe hear your thoughts on these books, read your reviews, maybe see what other books didn't quite make it but you enjoy, where might they find you on the internets?
Okay, so I have a book blog. It's yourwordsmyink.com, and I'm on all the social media platforms as Your Words My Ink, so you can find me everywhere. And I also run a book club Discord called the Read Better Book Club. So you can find me there as well. You can come and read along. Our May book club pick, when is this episode going up?
This will go out it will be out in April. I think it's Tuesday or the Tuesday after.
Okay. Our May book club pick is The Reckless Afterlife of Harriet Stoker. I think that's the title. May is my birthday, so I got to pick the book. So if you want to join us, you can find the link in any of my social medias for the Discord. And yeah, I had a lot of fun talking about these books.
Excellent. And I think I might have to check. I've never been part of a book club, but I've always wanted to join one. So I may.
It's so much fun.
I will have to come and check that out. So thank you again so much for joining us, listeners. If you want to follow the podcast, we're at Books to Last Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the places that do podcasts. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or tell someone else you know might like it. And thank you so much for listening. Until next time, bye for now.